Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Neuroscience of Mental Health. We're going to be giving you a user's guide to your brain. Today, we're going to be talking about brain development. There are three stages of brain development that we really are going to be talking about. The first one is the childhood brain, which is really from about birth or maybe in the womb to about age 11 or 12. The next is adolescence, which is 11 or 12 till about 25, 28. And then we have the adult brain. Each of the stages has different goals. So we're going to start talking about the childhood brain first. So when we're born, we have a ton of neurons. We have neurons to learn just about anything we want to learn, but those neurons aren't connected. There are very few connections when we're first born. So I want you to picture the brain as like a jungle. So there's that tangled mess of vines you can't really get through. That's kind of what the brain is like. And every time we have experiences, like you went to the zoo, you did Legos, you did sports, every time you had those experiences when you were young, your neurons fired. And as they fired, they began to clear pathways through that jungle. So the first time they clear, they're just clearing a little bit. It's not like you can just clear it once and then there's a pathway through it. You have to keep clearing and clearing. Every time you fire the brain, fire those neurons, they begin to form a more clear pathway. So if you think about it, if you try and do the ABCs, you can do those really, really quickly. I often do an exercise where I have people say the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s till 26. You can try it if you want to. And they can do it really quickly. And then I ask them to do it, but do A1, B2, C3, D4. That becomes much harder because the pathways that we've cleared become really easy, but those that we haven't are more difficult to get through. So that takes a lot more thinking. So in the childhood brain, our biggest goal is just to create those pathways. We can create pathways throughout our lives, but during childhood, that's really the goal of the brain. The next stage is adolescence. So we're creating all these pathways in the brain, neural pathways in the brain when we're young. And then we begin in adolescence to try and get the brain to be more efficient. Thinking about it like cleaning your room. If you want to clean your room, you start with getting rid of things that you haven't used in a while. So the first thing, well, not first, sorry, one of the things that the adolescent brain does to kind of clear away and get more efficient is to prune away neurons that you haven't used. So think about having all the neurons that you need to learn any language without an accent. But you haven't learned Russian by the time you're in like 6th, 7th grade, and your brain says, haven't used those neurons, might as well get rid of them. So that's pruning. The neurons literally begin to disappear. The other part of adolescence is to pave those pathways that we have cleared. So remember those ABCs, and we can do those really quickly. That's because we've gone through that pathway. We fired those neurons so many times that we cleared a pathway. And then in adolescence, we begin to pave those pathways that are cleared with something called a myelin sheath. It's just a fatty substance, but what it does is it makes the brain more efficient. It makes those neural signals go faster. Travel faster. So it makes it faster, but it also makes it more permanent. So pruning and paving make the brain more efficient, but it also makes it less plastic, less able to be changed. So if you have, I know sometimes probably you and your parents have trouble learning technology. They don't learn it as quickly as you do. That's because their pathways were paved during adolescence, and it's much more difficult to learn new things. So whereas we're fast with our thinking, learning new things is more difficult as you get older and as you're finished with that adolescent phase of pruning and paving. We can learn throughout our lives, but During childhood and adolescence, it's much easier. And as our brains begin to prune and pave, they become a little bit more permanent, but a little bit more efficient. So childhood brain is just creating those pathways. We're continuing to create pathways, but during adolescence, we're pruning and we're paving to get more efficient. One of the things to keep in mind is the highest level thinking that you guys have, that any of us have, is in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. It's this part right up here in the forehead. The prefrontal cortex is kind of like the boss of your brain. It's in charge of making sure that you can, you have self-control, that you can plan ahead, you can organize, all the skills that you're going to want to have as you head off to college to be able to know when to study, when you can take a break, all of that stuff. And that is, those neurons are fired when we practice those skills. So it's kind of during unstructured time when you have some of the time off. I know that's so difficult right now because I know in high school sometimes you guys are getting up early, you're doing your classes, you're doing your sports, then you're coming home and doing your homework. But it's important to try and get that unstructured time and creative time in for your brains so that you can develop those prefrontal cortex pathways. The next thing we're going to be talking about with a healthy brain is brain chemicals, neurotransmitters, and hormones. Those are like little text messages that are going to your brain, telling you what, driving your behavior, telling you what to do. We're going to go through just a couple of them that are important to keep in mind, and we'll see in terms of mental health why these are so important to us. The first one is dopamine. It's the reward message, and it just says to our brain, wow, that felt good, do it again. It's kind of this message, I liked that. And we can get small bursts of dopamine or big bursts of dopamine, depending on what we're doing. And we'll learn more about that as we keep moving ahead. Next one is oxytocin. That's the bonding message, and it's what we get when we feel loved, when we get a hug from somebody, when we pet our dog, when we're interacting with people, when we get a like or somebody to follow our Instagram or we get a Snapchat. Those are we get this little burst of oxytocin, of the bonding that somebody cares about us. Endocannabinoids are a bliss message that says, hey, everything's okay. You don't have to worry. Things are going well. GABA is a calm down message. It says that's also an anti-anxiety. It kind of says, it's all right. You don't need to get stressed about this. You don't need to get worried about it. Things are going okay. Serotonin is the confidence message. It says, wow, you're really good at that. So when we work really hard and we struggle and we finally meet the goal that we're really trying to do, when we get that goal in soccer, when we get an A on the test, we get a burst of serotonin that says, wow, I'm good at this. Cortisol is a danger message. It says to our brain, hey, you're in trouble. You got to get ready to move. You got to get ready to get out of the way. So that's an important message to get, but we have to know when we're getting it and be in control of understanding that. Adrenaline and epinephrine are neurochemicals or brain chemicals that say to us, wow, this feels good because it's so exciting. And adolescence is really a time when adrenaline, we're driven towards that adrenaline rush that feels really good, especially good in adolescence. So those are the neurochemicals that you have to think about, the messages that we want to get for our brain. We learned about brain development, that in childhood we're forming those pathways, which we can continue to form. In adolescence, we're pruning and paving. And in adulthood, we're hoping for an efficient brain. We talked about that we need to develop that prefrontal cortex, and we'll talk about that more later. But as we're talking about brain development, the last thing that I want to leave you with is that mindset matters, that it is important. The way that we think can affect the way our bodies respond, that those brain pathways that we develop around thinking about things affect how we respond. And I want to talk about Kelly McGonigal is a scientist. She did a TED Talk that's awesome, and it's called Making Stress Your Friend. And she used to tell people how stress is dangerous for you. It can cause heart attacks and all of that. And then she read a study that they did. It was a 30-year study where they followed people and they said to them ahead of time, do you have high stress or low stress? And do you think stress is good for you or bad for you? People with high stress who thought stress was good for them actually did quite well. People with high stress that thought stress was bad for them died. They tended to have a high rate of heart attacks, and they wanted to understand why. So they did a study on it and found that if you think stress is good for you, in response to stress, your arteries don't constrict. If you think stress is bad for you, in response to stress, your arteries constrict, which becomes a problem in your heart. So we need to recognize that our mindset matters. The way we think about things matter. Those brain pathways that we're developing are really important because they can affect how our bodies respond as well. So we want to think about the brain pathways that we're developing. And through these 10 lessons, we're going to really understand a lot more about those pathways and about the neurochemicals and why they're so important for our brain health. Next time on Friday, we're going to be talking about the 4 R's that you need to be developing, and that ties right in with that prefrontal cortex. We'll see you then.